So I just want to welcome all of you to our AI chapter Silicon Slopes event, our Lunch and Learn, and we're really glad you're here to show us your support. We are going to be hearing from Dr. Carlos Kemeny. He recently joined Cinch's executive team. He leads the data science and AI there. Prior to Cinch, he co-founded DrumData.ai, and it's an AI research and services company, and DrumCV, an NLP venture-backed company, led data science at Weave Communications, and also strategically advised several Fortune 250 C-suites and senior executives while working at Domo. And he is also known as the AI decision guy. He has a great podcast as well that you'll have to check out. So in this Lunch and Learn, we're going to be talking about the role of AI in decision making and whether you should trust AI in your decision making. And he's going to talk about the importance of trust and also share the findings from a groundbreaking AI versus human decision making study. Our Lunch and Learn today is sponsored by the Software Technology Group. They have extensive experience in digital consulting, transformation, strategy, information security, global staffing, and technical proficiency. They will be hosting a webinar on February 28th around AI autonomous agents, and we will be sending a follow-up email with that link so you can learn more about what they are doing. We are going to be having our next Lunch and Learn on March 19th, so be sure to mark your calendars, lunch at 11:30, and then the speaker presentation will be at 12. And we're going to be listening to Jordan Morrow, and he is known as the godfather of data literacy. He's also the founder and CEO of Body Data. So that's something to look forward to. So I'll turn the time over to Carlos, and he will share his presentation.
It is great to be with you. I am excited about sharing something that I'm very passionate about. I thought, I've been watching some of the reruns from The Office. I thought I'd give you a 45-point, 45-day, 1 point per day plan. But I'm going to give you today a talk about trust, AI trust, and how much we trust AI today. This is a fascinating topic because oftentimes we talk about data-driven decision-making, which I do not like. I don't like that phrase. And part of that is because I'll present some of this today to you. But the reason why I don't like that term is because we are decision-makers. That is what we are. We are decision-making beings, if you will. And we are very data-driven. In fact, we process millions of bits of data every single second. And so inherently we are. And so let me present some of the things that I found, as well as some prescriptions for what you can do in your lives and in your organizations. So the agenda today is I'll present findings from research that I've done on AI and decision-making. I'm going to give you some prescriptions on how to engineer products, trustworthy AI products, and then I want to convince you at the end of the talk to make deliberate and responsible AI decisions. And I'll prescribe a couple ways for you to do that specifically. So let me tell you about the lens by which I look through, because I think that's important. For any decision scientist, which I would say that I am by training, I'd like to at least share with you my perspective and where that's coming from. First, I've lived in several different places. So I've lived in Brazil, I've lived in Portugal, and I've lived all across the United States in each of the ecosystems. I have an engineering, economics, and a decision-making public policy background. My dissertation was on decision-making in environments of uncertainty. I studied institutions like non-competes and inevitable disclosure, which is a stronger form of trade secret protection, and how investors, VCs, would invest in different states because of these policies. And I also studied how states vote, their political orientation, and also how VCs and private equity invests in states based on a red-red or blue-blue governor, president orientation, and found some very interesting things there as well. And so a lot of that research fed into let's look at uncertainty. Let's figure out these environments of uncertainty and see how that affects investment decision making. My experience in industries, I worked in higher ed. I did a dual PhD at Carnegie Mellon, and I became an administrator at the University of Texas System under Bill McRaven. If you know, he had just left as the Joint Chiefs, and he led that institution, and I participated in the administration there. Have experience in government and then tech companies. Been through 2 IPOs at Domo and at Weave. And then now I'm an AI executive. I'm also a former founder. I founded a VC-backed company. And so all of those experiences have informed the way that I look at decisions. And then a lot of my professional expertise has been in BI, it's been in data, and now AI. And then at the end of the talk, I'll focus on why I feel the way I do about the future of AI, based on important things to me, like faith and family. So I'm going to have you do a 2-minute exercise. If you don't mind bringing out your phone or a laptop, the Wi-Fi is here if you need to connect. But I'd like to ask you for a couple minutes to go through the study. What you'll find if you go to research.DrumData.ai is that you'll have a bundle of 15 different decisions. And there is a 2x2 quadrant here where the y-axis is at the bottom, 100% human decision making, and at the top of the y-axis is 100% AI decision making. You'd be okay in your sleep to let AI make that decision for you in your sleep. And on the left, on the x-axis, all the way on the left, is inconsequential decision, which would maybe be a repeatable decision that doesn't have a lot of consequence, versus a consequential decision. All the way on the right, maybe this is more of a one-time, very important decision. So if you would take that study, then you'll have a good understanding of what we've researched over the last couple of years. So I'll give you a couple minutes to do that. Okay, it looks like we're getting a server error, which is unfortunate. But we'll wrap up, and then I'm going to actually have you speak to maybe a partner. If you could pick somebody on your left or right. And while I don't think the heat map then is working right now, what I'll do is I'll make sure that we get you, hopefully it submitted the email, I'll check that, and then I can send you your own results after. But what I'd like you to do is take 2 minutes to talk to a neighbor about similarities and differences in what you answered. So if you could do that for 2 minutes. Okay, we're going to wrap up, and I will show you the findings from the study. So I'm going to ask you to finish up here in the next 5 seconds. Okay, very good. Okay, so hopefully that was a good exercise. Hopefully it opened up thoughts that maybe you haven't had or haven't discussed before. I'd like to maybe ask, if it's okay, let's just get 2 comments. So I like being able to open this up. But would somebody be willing to share the similarities and differences? And I'd love for somebody just to raise their hand really quick. So on this side of the room, is there somebody that'd be okay? Yes, thank you.
I guess primary care physician. I would want no part with AI with that, right? I want my doctor, I have to talk to him, and I have to trust him, right?
Right.
That was pretty similar.
Similar, right?
Yeah.
Did you find across the decisions, were you somewhat similar in what you guys had put? Maybe some variants, but for the most part?
Yeah, a couple things. You want to talk about, Ben?
Yeah, which was the one that we, it was retirement
The
funds.
social media liking.
In social media liking, I actually put that as I didn't want a bot to automate that one. Okay. Whereas it was like, that's very much a task that machine learning models could do fairly well and probably match, but I still feel like it's very much like a social thing, and like I'm showing my support for this and I've seen it.
Great, thank you. Wonderful. Is there someone from this side of the room that would be willing to share? Brian, that's great.
We noticed there was kind of an interesting interplay between the level of commitment that a decision required. So for example, a one-time investment, large, when you make that large investment, usually, typically, you're going to be invested, and that's like, it's your one shot. Whereas portfolio allocations, your long-time retirement portfolio, you can offload positions, you can re-optimize. It's not a long-term commitment. Same with dating. We noticed this pattern between each other. dating was like, yeah, we're open to AI kind of informing and being a little more involved in that. Whereas a long-term commitment, like marriage, felt like a decision that was more personal and required our involvement.
Very good. Thank you. You know, it's interesting. Hopefully, this was helpful in opening up again the mindset that decision making requires what? Trust. Hopefully that theme, if we're going to trust, or if we're going to make a decision off of data, or AI in this case, there better be trust. And ultimately, the more consequential a decision is, it seems like for some things, you're going to have a lot of need to control that decision, right? And for other things, maybe not as much. And so I'm going to go into the findings from this. And so finding number 1, we are similar in how we trust AI to make decisions. This is generally true. Now, there are some outliers, of course, but let me show you the distribution here. And what you're going to see is that for the majority of these decisions, it did follow a good distribution within a quadrant, in a quadrant approach. And as you can see, the majority of answers here in each of these decisions, you see the heat map for each one of these decisions, follows generally that trend, which is fascinating to me, right? It's not too clouded. Now, even for the ones that were a little bit more outside of just a strict quadrant grid, you still had a pretty well-bounded distribution within an offset of that quadrant, which is also very interesting. Okay, finding number 2. And by the way, when I talk to somebody now for about 5 minutes, I'm pretty good at picking most of them within an inch or two of where they select it, which is also interesting. Number 2, generally we don't trust AI to make decisions yet. So let me go through the average. The average human, the average score for trusting AI to make a decision today is 4.5 in this survey, which I found to be very fascinating. I thought it would be much higher. And interestingly enough also, which isn't counter to any type of intuition, but the younger generations certainly trust AI to make decisions for them more, which is also very interesting. Now, of the 15 decisions from the study, only one of them had an average score of over 7. So that's also very interesting, right? There are a few of those that seem pretty inconsequential, yet people still want to have some level of control. So this 1 over 7 was actually the route detour driving decision. And I find this incredibly important as a result, because with an average score of 7.5, for a technology that's been around for a long time, shouldn't we have trust in this, right? And yet the score isn't closer to 10. Now here's some trivia. What year was the first commercially available GPS released on the market? Anybody know? 2002. Good guesses. 1989. Pretty expensive GPS, right? But the technology now has been around for 35 years on the market. Does anybody else find that interesting, that 35 years ago, we started using GPS? Now, when you drive, if you're anything like me, you don't carry a map with you anymore. And so this is problematic when your phone dies. You don't know where to go, right? And so we kind of program our decision-making about making sure that we have access to an outlet. Of course, this has now become a lot easier to do with USB ports or different type of power systems in cars, right? They've engineered for this to solve that problem. But it shows that the route detour, which is not the same as GPS, certainly there's an algorithm that's made that now routes us, but we still don't trust that much for a technology that's been around for a while. Now, finding number 3, when using AI, context matters. If there's one thing from the findings that you actually take away from the study, it's this one. And I'll tell you why. It's because of a trip that I took with my family to San Diego. Now, I have small kids, and taking a 10-hour trip is not that easy with small kids, especially when in the middle of Nevada, near Mesquite, I think exactly, I can almost tell you the longitude, latitude coordinates when I got a 45-minute delay on I-15. And that is not good, right? That's a long trip, not good. And Apple Maps pushed out this notification that said, hey, if you take this detour, and it's gridlock at this point, by the way, Apple says, go take this detour and you're going to reduce 25 minutes off of your time. Who's not going to do that, right? And the guy in front of me, he saw the same notification. So he spins out. We both go down the exit right there, and we go down these back roads, these village roads, if you will, and we get to this T. And GPS is telling us to go straight onto a dirt road, and the T has a bunch of cars backed up to get onto the highway too. And so clearly in a Honda Odyssey, you're not getting through the rocky terrain. And so we had to turn around. It added 25 minutes to the already 4 minutes delay. Now, am I ever going to use the route detour in Mesquite ever again? Absolutely not. I'm never using the route detour in Nevada. I'm staying on I-15. Context matters. And so if you're engineering, and we'll talk about this in the prescription, but boundary, the problem around trust, that's the context, right? And if you're in I-15 in Utah and you know the roads, are you more willing to trust it or maybe make a more deliberate decision? The answer is absolutely yes. Now, other people experience this too. You just look at the news and see all of the precarious situations that people have gotten into by taking route detours. And it actually opens up, just in that strand, a fascinating research discussion. Now, there's some other things that we found interesting here. So if you can notice, the average consequential score for these two decisions, we've got a retirement investment and a college decision. And what we have is that you have highly different average AI trust scores for these. For the retirement decision, it's just different. So it also shows that even in the same line of consequence, we have different ways that we trust AI based on the decision we're making. Context matters. And then we look at the liking a social media post. This one was actually the most fun one, because I didn't realize how closely, and these are the two most similar, by the way, scores on the bottom of that axis. The marriage decision is a good baseline for us in this study. It's a good one. It kind of, it lets us know, and I think a good money-making scheme from this is, if you do highly rate this, then it probably would be a good opportunity to refer to a marriage counselor. But anyway, but looking at the liking a social media post, so the marriage decision is a very, this is a proactive decision, right, for your future. What I found with the liking a social media post is, can anybody guess what was the main reason why they didn't want to like a social media? It probably is similar to maybe why you didn't want an AI to pick it, but especially in a political season. Does anybody have any guesses why somebody wouldn't want to auto-like a politician's post? You can get canceled. You can get fired. You can, right? The penalty is high. So do you see there's an interesting also lesson here about context, is the incentive at the end. The incentive for a marriage decision versus, again, positive, if you will, in that space, versus the negative incentive space. It's fascinating to think about that. So finding number 4, there are pathways of trust for AI in decision making. I like this one with the dating and the marriage decision, because this is very well visible. People don't trust AI for marriage decisions, but they do for dating. A little bit more, not all the way, but they do want some input maybe for matching. And so they're okay, and then this up and to the left curve from that. There's a pathway. How about the retirement investments and the one-time investments? You see kind of a downward trend here. Again, you see kind of it moves down. For a retirement investment, we're okay with maybe an Autobot, a robo-investor that's going to portfolio this. But when it comes down to an oil investment, some of us may not want to invest in oil. Maybe some are okay with that, but we want to have a little bit more of a hand in making that decision. And so we see a little bit of a downward movement there. Isn't this interesting? So there's a pathway in building products where people can trust and then use that to help them make decisions. Okay, finally, finding number 5. Even in contexts where humans would struggle to make decisions, they don't always inherently trust AI. This was the reason why we put number 14, fraud detection. Now, this is an important result, because how many of us can use data to do fraud detection across a population? We don't really have the data, right? Like, all we have is our own data. Now, how many people actually download that data, observe it over history? Actually, in banks, they just give you the last CSV or the statement, and then you have to like parse all of that together. It's not like an open API. You know, there's not an API call really that makes this easy. And so maybe you're using a Mint or, you know, an aggregator or a transactional history tool. But how many people, how many consumers actually do that? But how many people could actually find fraud when you need population data to do that? And yet, if only the banks can do this, or only other types of technologies can do this, why on earth would people not trust fraud detection, especially because it's not that much of a penalty if you find something that's an error, but you know, false, right? That now you have to cancel your credit card. At least they protected you, right? But the average score here was 6.6, which I can't believe. But it shows just the beginnings of this point, which is even when people should trust it, because they can't even do it, they still don't trust it. So the question is why then? Now, I don't have a great answer yet. You have to understand this research for causal is really hard. So I will give you some of my hypotheses. And one of the plans for this, by the way, is to make this a lot more robust and to take this to study populations. Wouldn't it be interesting to understand cultural differences or variances, right? Or look at this for age, or look at for professional roles. Wouldn't it be interesting to understand blue collar versus white collar and understand how much they trust, right? But I do have a few thoughts or hypotheses. So number one, why should we expect AI to be to create more trust than the failing data paradigm of today? Now, you may disagree with me that the data paradigm is failing, but I can tell you right now that I do have some data on this, just a little bit. Not rigorous, but the beginnings of it. So I asked tech companies in Utah Valley, how much do you trust your data? No AI, don't even think about AI. Think about your BI. How much do you trust data to make decisions today? 2.4 out of 10. Does anybody find that to be funny? But two, do you kind of feel the same about your own data? I think this is really a great statistic because it proves a point, which is people don't trust the non-automated, non-observable. I can show you in a data warehouse where the data comes from. I can validate stages of that data. Now, not everybody does that. But when it goes from raw to data, you know, from that connection, if I'm now kind of creating a reconciliation, I can do that, and I can show the observability. And yet people don't trust that. So now strip away all the observability, strip away the transparency of an AI model. How much more should we expect AI to be trusted then when all of that doesn't exist? So this actually does give rise to what I think is one of the most important foundational points of AI development, which is how do we solve the observability problem? There's another point here, which is the consumer who doesn't even understand AI. But they see in their mail. Now, what a great time in between Christmas and New Year's to send out data breach letters. If I was a privacy officer at a company, of course I would send it during New Year's, in between Christmas and New Year's, right, in mail. But I got 3 of these in that week. And I get a continuous stream. I don't even know how many data breach letters I've gotten now at this point. I don't know if you guys are the same. Do you get data notification breaches on a regular basis now? Why should anyone, again, trust the data operation and AI, right? If now we don't have observability, but we also have breaches and all of this. It creates a lot of tension in this idea of why should I even trust, right? Now, I have one more thing that I'd like to, and I do like Hugh Jackman, sure. But it's the Jean Valjean effect. That's kind of what I'm calling it. There's kind of a deeper, more existential reason theory that I have, which is one of the reasons why we don't trust AI is we don't want to be displaced. We don't want our decision making to be displaced. And Jean Valjean is a good example of this. If you don't know about Les Mis from Victor Hugo, Jean Valjean goes to prison because he steals bread to feed kids. And one can say by the law that he was wrong because he didn't follow the law and he stole the bread. But others could say he was doing something for the greater good. You know, it's bread, but it's saving lives, right? And this power to make a decision is actually what makes us very human. This decision making, right? If you think about the molecular reasoning behind a human versus AI and this idea about sentience, right? The real question is that decision making, that molecule of decision making, if you will. Is that a human thing? Is that a human experience? And I would say the answer is yes. That's my vote. And so I believe that many don't trust AI to make decisions for them because of the Jean Valjean effect. Therefore what? So we have some findings. How do I help you today? What can you do to make better AI products? Because that's great research, but okay, whatever, right? Until you have something you can do. So prescription number one. If I was building, and we are building at Cinch, we're following this roadmap. And by the way, if you don't have an AI roadmap or a framework, you should. But we have a framework in which we're operating off of that first targets trusted products to incrementally benefit your products and services with AI that are already trusted. You have a much lower hurdle than trying to build a product that now net new has to be trusted without AI, right? That's hard to do. As a former founder, it's hard to get 0 to 1. It's hard to get product market fit. So if you have features that customers love, I would always start by incrementally benefiting that with AI. You already have a baseline. You can kind of measure the experience. And I'd actually don't even tell people that you just injected it with AI if you don't need to. See if the experience is better. Don't even form any type of question on trust. And then start understanding what the impact is, maybe on your cost. Maybe you're more efficient, more profitable. Maybe you're giving a better experience and they recognize that. That helps. And so I would message that based on this incremental improvement that you're doing. So I'd always start there. I would not do blue sky today. The ROI is very questionable. The timelines can be very long. The investment can be very big. So again, incrementally improve trusted products. Prescription number 2, categorize potential projects in 3 buckets. And I would say, and again, this could expand, but I've picked 3 major buckets to do this with. The first bucket is that generative creativity bucket. When I say generative creativity, maybe this is, I'm gonna have DALL-E create an image for me and then I can kind of work off of that. Or I'm gonna ask it to give me some ideas about how to write this email or whatever, right? The task automation. I would bucket number 2 with task automation is taking existing tasks and again, creating automation from that. And then bucket number 3 is the decision-making bucket. I would start there. Certainly you can create other categories. But why would I bucket these 3 categories? It's because we would treat them differently in terms of how people will trust, the thresholds of trust. I'm a big fan of the word sufficiency with data. Oftentimes when we go and we try to put a project together with data, you're trying to figure out what the person needs, right? And anything above, if we look at this from an economic perspective, anything more is overshooting. It's more expensive. Anything less is not sufficient. It's underperforming. And so what we're constantly trying to figure out in delivery is figuring out that perfect maximum, right? The max point, right? The tipping point at which we are sufficient. And I would suggest that until you understand what is sufficient with trust in each of these buckets, then you're over-engineering or under-engineering. Now let me use an example with generative. With generative, would we trust generative differently in a Photoshop generative fill? Like I love that experience, by the way, in Photoshop. I love being able to kind of edit a photo, press a button, and then it edits it. But what I'm doing in the creative space is I don't need a lot of trust. I'm playing with it. I'm trying to figure out how to do this. It's taking away some of the work of the creation. Versus in the task automation, I do need a boundary and I need some conditions. And so trust is a higher, would you agree that trust is more requisite in a task automation, even if, especially if it's more consequential, in like, let's say a warehouse, I'm gonna need more trust in that before I deploy it out, correct? So you already start seeing how trust can be kind of mapped to each of these categories. Now let me use an example on the, in the generative space, and how this works. Well, actually more in the task automation. Let me do that. So we put together a study with DrumCV, and DrumCV was taking long text, think in a customer support ticket, and figuring out how to use NLP, natural language processing, to get it to a very predictable, very precise, very descriptive, short form text summarization. And to do that well, and to deduplicate in that process as well. And what we asked people to do, we did a study, and we had them do 3 exercises. And we asked them to label a support ticket in these 3 exercises. Exercise 1 was, we'll give you some rules of the do's and don'ts on how to label it, and we're gonna have you do that free form. So here's the ticket. Now, don't do this, create the label. Exercise 2 was we gave them a standard structure. Put the verb here, put the description here, put the noun here, right? And then the 3rd exercise was hit OpenAI and then edit it, so using that structure that we had, edit it and then submit it. Now we measured 3 things. First, the speed that they completed these exercises, the quality, which would be judged by us to make sure that it was a good quality, and then the 3rd was how easy was it to complete the exercise. Now, all 3 exercises, the quality was pretty good. The first exercise was a little bit less than the other 2, but it wasn't tremendously significant, but all of them were very good quality-wise. The speed of the 3rd one was much faster than the 2nd, so the OpenAI solution was much faster than the 2nd, and the 2nd was much faster than the 1st. And then the 3rd one, the ease of use. This is what we found. I think this is really interesting. In the first exercise, they've rated it 6 out of 10, 10 being the hardest in this scale. The second one with the structure was a 4 out of 10 in terms of ease of use. And OpenAI, even though it was 50% wrong in giving that first label, and so they had to edit it still, they rated it a 1 out of 10. And I think this is really interesting as it pertains to this. And what we believe to be the case here is that creation is hard versus refinement, which is a lot easier for people, which also would suggest why entrepreneurs are more rare, right, in society. This is another theory. But the idea of creation being difficult for people, and if you give them a little bit, now they can do a lot more with it. So again, categorization helps us, I think, in figuring out how to treat these products and how to release them. And so don't start with decision making. I would say that as a general truth. It is very hard right now to get anybody to, even with a 35-year-old technology, to trust AI for their decisions. So avoid it. Do the other 2. Prescription number 3, deploy reliable co-pilots, not pilots. Now, there's a reason why we see Copilot being branded with Microsoft. It's a reason why we see lots of human in the loop now starting to come out. Again, in the generative space, we see a lot of things that are much more free form, right? But when we talk about task automation, there still needs to be verifiable trust. And the Copilot approach that involves human in the loop is a much more sound way to play into trust than to avoid that by just expecting people will trust you inherently. Again, you see this concept of trust coming into every single aspect of this discussion, hopefully. Prescription number 4, simplicity, clarity, transparency, observability, build trust, which leads to adoption. So in what we do at Cinch, what we are baking into our products is the ability to show users the data, maybe in a preview, some way that they can digest and see what's going on in this black box. And why do we do that? And why should you do that? It's because for people that don't do that, which one has more trust? Number 1. Number 2, the simplicity aspect is very important. You can't just show everything. People can't digest everything. They don't look at data like that all the time. And so figure out how to present a view to your users in any product that you use AI that will then instill more trust. Simplicity is a good way to do that. The clarity is important as well. The elegance of clarity is so important. And then transparency and observability. Being able to look inside an AI model today continuously is very challenging. And even in BI, I noticed when you present BI to an executive team, they forget all the nuances of the definitions because there's so many problems they're dealing with. And so you see how these four play together. So it has to be so masterfully done, and it should be very deliberate how you do that. And then prescription number 5, I'm going to let Leonardo DiCaprio, if this works, tell the story. So let's see if this works. Okay. We won't have the sound here, but I'll tell you what's going on here. If you remember Titanic, Leonardo DiCaprio takes Kate Winslet and says, "Do you trust me?" And she closes her eyes and reaches out her hands, and she says, that she opens her eyes, "I'm flying." And so I would like to suggest that Leonardo DiCaprio is the company, Kate Winslet is the consumer, and for your consumers to fly, they need to trust, right? And so from that standpoint, I would say there is a 5th point, which is harming consumer trust will sink your AI product, like the Titanic, right? So anything you do in your company that harms trust will actually have an effect on the AI trust. And so that's an important piece here, which is everything we do as we now kind of enter into an AI product paradigm requires elevated trust across the whole company. And so these data breach letters, they will harm AI product trust. And so this is an important piece. So I would, anytime there's a product released, anytime there's a bug, anytime there's something that affects the greater consumer base of a product, of a company, I would think of that holistically and understand how do we build back that trust or recoup it or not let it get harmed too much, because it will affect everything. Okay, with that, I'm going to wrap up the talk with kind of a final piece here, as I said I would, the future of society. I do want to get a little philosophical here because as a platform for DrumData, which has a mission to help people deliberately and responsibly adopt AI in society, I'd like to point out that there is what I believe to be a lazy assumption in the AI revolution that I see a lot of people making, and I want to kind of challenge that assumption, which is a lazy assumption that we will adapt like every other paradigm before. The economics degree that I had was in technological change, so I've studied technological change, and I've studied kind of these points of no return. Think the Pony Express. Were we ever going back to communications after the Pony Express was able to take communication from one place to another? Were we able to ever go back once the telephone was delivered to the consumer? Were we able ever to go back after email was enabled or SMS? The answer is no. We keep on moving forward, and we can never. It's point of no return. And this idea that we have similarities and therefore we can automatically assume that this next paradigm will just be like the other one, and we're so good at adapting, I'd like to challenge. Let me tell you the two things, just two of the reasons why I think that it is different. First, decision making. Can you think of a previous technology that affected decision making as much as AI will? I can't. I've tried very hard to do this. A lot of the technology that's been invented so far has been around labor productivity, around the task automation piece. And today, I would challenge that AI is challenging now and focusing most on the decision making, which is a very different type of objective. And two, the rates of change. We know that with technology paradigms that they do accelerate, right? They build upon each other. But I would also propose that we are now finally on this curve where exponential growth in terms of the rate is very, very different than previous paradigms. And that presents a very, very complex challenge and consequence. Now, there are two consequences today, and there's many consequences to this, but if these assumptions are correct as they're different, then there are also different consequences. And I would propose that there's 2 consequences that we can focus on today, which is first, if we default adopt AI, we will develop decision-making paralysis, especially for bigger decisions. Now, let me kind of use the example here. If we remove car driving, which has skill requirement, the decision-making skills requirements for, let's say, teenagers. Now, I'm not saying that all teenagers need to have that to make good decisions. That's certainly not true. But let's take a look at if you now remove decision-making skills that are gained, which are very complex from teenagers, that have very consequential results, right? Then how do we replace them? The assumption in the previous paradigms is we'll adapt. But have you ever watched a teenager that now doesn't have to mow the lawn because something is now being mowed by itself? Do they now go to higher order things? You know, if you have a teenager? Not really. Like, they're probably more on their phone, right? Probably more on social media. And we see that with a good precursor to, I think, this paradigm, which is social media, by the way. But unless we deliberately replace decision-making, building skills, there is a risk of apathy. Because now, if we remove that foundational level of decision-making, because now AI can take care of it, then how do you make bigger decisions? You don't. It's too hard. And in fact, we already see this with trends in teenagers even wanting to drive, by the way. There's a lot more teenagers, there's lots of statistics that show teenagers are now delaying getting even driver's licenses, and gap years in college, going to college. These are just a few things that we've already started seeing because of the things around the world. But now if you layer the automation of decision making on these foundational things, tell me how they're going to make bigger decisions, because they won't. The only way that you get better at making decisions is making more decisions. Period. I don't know if, hopefully you've never, I know that sounds so basic, but I don't think anybody's said that. It's just like lifting weights. And 2, if we default adopt AI like social media, we've been talking a lot about the mental health crisis, but if we now layer in the rates is what I'm concerned about, the rates of displacement. You know, I was in San Jose in 2002, and I saw various people at different parks that had been executives at high growth startups on the streets. They'd lost everything. And there were plenty of these folks. My heart went out to them. But I look at that situation, and I think that the mental health crisis as we know it is just a breadcrumb if we don't solve for this issue as well. So there's 2 things that I want to leave you with of what you can do then to help solve some of these things. This is not comprehensive, but it's a couple things you can do. So at Cinch, the job postings that I've started putting out have a section. And that section is the decisions you will be responsible for and empowered to make. And I'm calling out specifically in a job, what decisions will you make? Being very deliberate about that. Why? Most people don't think about that. But what differentiates a person from something that can be automated? A decision. CEOs have a fiduciary responsibility to automate what they can. Why? Because it's more profitable. So if we forget that point and expect people to just do social good, well, capitalism is not that, sorry, right? It's just not that. And so now we kind of move into this, well, let's do a 2-mission, 3-mission tier system, right? Like, okay, we can have that conversation. But in this world where profits are the objective, the fiduciary responsibility of the CEO is to ensure the maximum profit. And as such, come as it may be, you're going to automate anybody that has a task that can be automated. What is less automatable is decision making. Now, the New York Times just talked about this recently, that white collar is going to be now the target of AI, which I agree with. Why do I agree with that? Because there's a lot of uncertainty in how bad managers manage. And so if we can remove uncertainty around management, that actually resolves a lot of challenges in the workplace today. But if you can build decision making by, number 1, making that the focus of a job, and 2, every promotion should have a delta between the decisions to be made today and the decisions made in that promotion. To me, it's not a promotion unless you have different decision-making power and breadth. And why do I think this will make a difference if we were to do this in every job posting in Utah? Is because now we're responsible in helping those who are not thinking about this and thinking about the displacement, hoping and being wishful that maybe their job won't be displaced even though it will. We're now participating in the solution instead of just watching from the sideline for something we know is going to happen. So I would propose that if everybody in this room were to start that, I'd love that. Start posting jobs that say decisions to be made that you're responsible for. And then finally, your own personal lives. I want to give something that I would recommend, and we'll be releasing a rubric for this, a framework for this. So over the next month, I'd love to send this out. I'd love to get the word out. But I firmly believe that to prevent against the decision-making apathy that I talked about, we have to do something on an individual level. I don't think the government will move fast enough to do this. Regulation will not solve this problem. And so this apathy requires much more of us in this new paradigm. And so my proposal to do that is that each of us in our individual, family, society, across society, assesses on a regular basis the decisions that we're outsourcing to AI versus those that are decisions that we're making. And to ensure that we have a good balance there, just like we would with any type of technology consumption, social media use, just like I talk to my kids about technology use. We're going to have to make the same types of deliberate decisions on what we're outsourcing versus what we are making ourselves for us to protect against apathy. And this kind of goes to the faith point. I like to end with this, but I do believe that decision-making is required. It's a requisite for human progress. Without decision-making, without the ability to learn from the mistakes and to improve on decision-making, we're not any different than a machine in many ways. Certainly there's parts that we could argue about the physical body, all of that. But that agency, that decision-making that we have is a fundamental core of what makes us special. And I'd just like to advocate for the fact that we should protect that and we should participate in figuring out how to help others to do that. And so with that, I have just 2 calls to action. First, avoid default adopting AI for decision-making. 2, create and implement this framework, a framework, and I'll help with that by releasing a couple ideas for that for you in the future here, to assess decisions you're outsourcing to AI. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, questions?
So you talked about lazy, whatever, but the
Lazy assumption.
lazy assumption. But it is true that everything that comes, eventually we get used to, and familiarity breeds like, oh, I trust this, be it driving a car, whatever, online banking. It's just like, oh, now it's just commonplace. Is there any research from the previous of adopting of previous technologies that just said you kind of expect it takes this long for something new to settle into the human brain because we're not trusting people?
Yeah.
Except in Utah County, they trust everything.
It's a great thing, and I think there's a mathematical way to evaluate this. If the rate of innovation from one model to the next is increasing at an exponential rate, and human learning is increasing at a linear rate or even a less exponential rate, what happens in the delta? So the rate of change, that speed, is what we're most concerned about. That's the mathematical concern, is as that area between these 2 curves gets bigger, we have serious concern for everybody that doesn't have that thing. So anybody that I want to hire right now, the people that I'm looking for are the people that are curious and can learn fast. I actually really don't have that many other requirements. I'm actually looking for people that can learn quickly. Because I don't know what I don't know. I feel like every time a new release from OpenAI happens, I have no idea how to make sense of the world for innovating the next paradigm, because I don't know how quickly that's going to be. But as we now kind of release and we see this exponential rate change, the point that I'm making is we don't know what happens. We have no way to now base that off of the same rate area from before. And it's really hard to make policy when you don't know. And I think all of us in this room, if we're kind of on the pro side of innovation, would be very weary of regulation coming out to stunt, prevent innovation in a competitive global environment, because there's other consequences to that. And so the challenge that we need to kind of really address societally right now is how do we learn faster? And so schools, for example, there's a lot of reluctance to use OpenAI in the schools. I have no idea why, from a standpoint of the outcome. But I have a lot of understanding on why people don't want to do it. They feel like they're going to be displaced. So education, which is core fundamental, foundational thing for us in society, how fast do they even change curriculums? It takes a year, right? How many times do legislatures meet to even kind of talk about the new policies? Every year. I just don't think that we move fast enough. And so that becomes this explanation of the lazy assumption of treating it similarly when the rates have changed drastically.
When you talk about building and nurturing trust, and you kind of brought up, I felt like you brought up, when software releases are done, if there's bugs in it, you hurt the trust. But that's something that's been there, obviously, since software began. To cultivate and build trust with your consumers, what would you advise? I mean, what are the pitfalls? What's different than software development in the past with relationship to AI?
Yeah, so DrumCV is good. Actually, we try to solve this with DrumCV. If you know the bugs based on the rate of bugs that are coming in with an alpha or a beta release, should you prevent those in the full launch? If you knew that the rate was above a threshold for bugs, right? The answer is yes. The problem is most people don't measure the bugs that are happening in alpha and beta. What they do is they see people's customer experience, they see if it's good, they generally kind of see what's happening, and then they do a full launch based on some product roadmap date. And very few people have I found that actually monitor and measure in an alpha to beta the actual quantities to measure the rate, the exit rate at a customer release with 20,000 customers versus 1,000, which I think is extremely problematic because the moment that you release that 20,000 customers, there's two things that happen. First, you're going to affect people at least the same rate that you did before. And two, you're a lot slower at that point to deploy because you're already on to the next roadmap item. And you have a lot more bugs that are now being made manifest in this full release. There's edge cases that you didn't account for. And so I think that today, even in software development, we don't do a good job at this. What's interesting to me about product teams, tell me how product teams are actually measured, performance is measured in a product team today. Most people don't have any clue, and so I give them a little bit of a start. There's three things. Did they get the roadmap done on time? Did they complete it? And are they a likable person? That's usually how product teams are actually measured today. If somebody gets a promotion or gets fired, right? What it should be is tied to the performance, right? Like, did it create revenue? Did you make a decision to pick the most important thing in the roadmap? And did you solution well? Did you do a good job deploying that solution out, which would be a bugs, would be like, did you actually create a solution that people needed? I think that we underappreciate what product management could be in that world, where if we held them to that standard, I actually think that they would be empowered to do it. But I think that these are trust decreasers. When we do that in dev, when we do it in product, we release things and we say, the roadmap is done, let's move on to the next one. And let's just deal with what people will accept because they're so satisfied with the problem being met, need being met, and we're deploying something out so they have something. I think that if we were to create much more visibility into and a focus on actually what builds trust and degrades trust, that does make a big difference, like the bugs.
But just to follow up, so like on your quadrant system, obviously, our ability to trust different of those choices, I don't think was based on the bugs or the quality of the code. It was more the principle behind the question. Outside of bugs, which involve, is there other ways that, you have something about observability, simplicity that you talked about in your stuff. But I'm trying to say that if the consumer doesn't trust AI, it's probably more than just the bugs that might be rolled out in a product. What are more specific things that, if we were building software, that we could build the trust for the consumer?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the failure modes are, the most obvious, right? And so that's why we kind of go there. But then there's, I think from sales expectations, what we map to what people should expect, to what they actually receive, that feeds in. So it's a much more holistic point, and certainly there's a lot that we can dive into. I think a lot of the things that I would first focus with are the failures. They're very visible. For example, in the data world, is the data actually verifiable? Is it observable? These kind of components are things that you can build trust with. Is it transparent, especially in an AI model? How do you do that? I think right now a lot of people are just saying and selling AI, like saying, hey, we have AI, it's going to do a bunch of things for you. The expectation now is there. It fails, that degrades trust very quickly. So the expectation to what people actually get, one, but the failure modes are actually kind of the biggest blind spot that is very visible to us that we still don't resolve today. We don't have a good answer for how to do with that. So those are probably the two areas that I'd focus on the most,
Well, we're at time, and we just wanted to thank Carlos for being our speaker. Also wanted to just invite all of you to join our AI chapter Silicon Slopes page on LinkedIn, so then that way you can know what other events are coming up. And if you're not already joined in the chapter itself, we're just at AI Silicon Slopes, and if you look us up, then we'll appreciate and be able to grow this chapter more. And if you're interested in either sponsoring one of these events or a great speaker, let us know also. So thank you, Carlos.